Hi, this is Dan Macon with UC Cooperative Extension in Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties. And this presentation is about livestock guardian dogs. Do these big white dogs really work? To give you an overview of what I'm going to discuss today, I'll set the context because this is really about my experience with dogs in our livestock operation. Talk a little bit about the environment and the predators in our area and the other types of tools that we use. Talk about the characteristics of a good livestock guardian dog, as well as the types of dogs that don't work, at least in my experience. Talk a little bit about correcting inappropriate behavior, offer some observations about interactions with wildlife, spend a little time talking about what formal research shows with respect to these dogs, and then outline some areas for further study. So in addition to serving as a livestock and natural resources advisor, we have a small-scale commercial sheep operation here in the Sierra foothills. Previously, I managed a 1,500 ewe operation in Rio Vista in California's Delta, and I've also worked as the Northern California project manager for a large-scale targeted sheep and goat grazing operation. And I'm currently the president of the California Wool Growers Association as well. Flying Mule Sheep Company is small scale, but we are range and pasture based. Our primary focus is to produce lambs and wool for sale. We also do some targeted grazing for fuel load reduction. We lamb on pasture in the Auburn area in late February and March, and then we also provide summer grazing for fuel load reduction in the foothills. We operate on fragmented rangeland and irrigated pasture. While we operate on some fairly large pastures, much of this is interspersed with residential development, with roads, and with a fair bit of human population. Our winter rangeland is 700 to 900 feet above sea level, largely oak woodland, you can see in that picture. And then our spring and summer pastures are on irrigated pasture at about 1,400 feet elevation. I should stress that we don't have any permanent fences. We use electronet fencing exclusively. And our primary predators are coyotes, dogs, and mountain lions. We do have black bears around. We have golden eagles around. And increasingly in our part of California, we worry about human theft. We're also just starting to think about wolves in our environment. I don't know that they'll ever come down into the foothills, but we have had wolves not too far to our northeast, and so it's something we're considering in terms of our predator protection tool. This gives you some sense of how we lamb. We do lamb on pasture, no facilities, and then we move to irrigated pasture with lambs. We typically wean those lambs in mid to late June. These are the kinds of predators that we've got around, and you can see that we've documented coyotes, foxes, and bobcats, all predators that we'd worry about with sheep. We know we have mountain lions around, but we've yet to capture one in our trail cams at this moment. But also on occasion we get the angry bluebird, and I'm not too worried about these predators, but it's interesting to see what the trail cameras will pick up. This is a photograph of OR 54. This is a wolf that was detected in eastern Nevada County in June of 2018. She's come down from Oregon. We do have an established pack in Lassen and Plumas County that has been confirmed to prey on livestock, mostly cattle. But adding this predator to our environment potentially could have some pretty serious implications for us. We're curious as to whether the dogs that we've currently been using that are very effective with coyotes can stand up to a larger predator like this. And we suspect we'll have to change the types of dogs that we'll use. Speaking of our dogs, we currently used mixed breed dogs, what the Wildlife Services calls American white dogs. We usually run one dog per bunch inside of electronet fencing. Those paddocks will range anywhere from 2 to 15 acres depending on season and volume of feed. We do increase our dog numbers in large paddocks or in paddocks where there's lots of brush or limited visibility. We have at least one dog with the ewes at lambing. Our preference is to use 2 dogs so that they can work together. And after quite a bit of trial and error, I do prefer puppies that we start ourselves, and I'll touch on this a little more later. So a good dog for us is one that stays with our sheep, even if the fence goes down or sheep break out. A good dog respects our electric fence, doesn't chase, chew on, or kill our sheep. Obviously, we don't want them harming the animals they're supposed to be protecting. Is respectful of lambing ewes, and for me that means giving them space to bond, but also protecting them from external predators. We like our dogs to be reasonably friendly with people, but to prefer the company of sheep. And ultimately, a good dog has to deter predators. That's the ultimate measure for us. In developing these dogs, we look at a couple of behavioral attributes that were first documented by a gentleman that brought dogs into the U.S. in the late 70s and early 80s, Ray Coppinger. So we look at their trustworthiness, and we can measure this through direct observation. Can we trust the dog with the sheep? Can we trust the dog to stay in our electric fences? We also measure their attentiveness, which can be measured through observation, and then we've started using some remote sensing tools to look at this as well. So we want to know, does the dog respond to appropriate stimuli? When a predator is in close proximity to the sheep, does the dog respond to that? And then we look at their protective behaviors, which we can also measure through observation and remote sensing. Part of this is how the dog acts around people it doesn't know. And then how does the dog interact with sheep in a variety of situations? Does the dog signal to the sheep when it's protecting them? Yeah, and that's a pretty interesting behavior. The ultimate metric, obviously, is that lack of predation, though. And an effective dog has to, we want to see no depredations in our paddocks if the dog's working. So how do we know what they're doing? Well, I've started using some home-built GPS tracking collars to determine where the dogs are and what they're doing at different times of day. This is a tracker called an Optimus GPS tracker, which was actually developed for delivery services for putting on vehicles. But it gives us real-time information about where the dogs are and how quickly they're moving via GPS signals, and then sending a signal to my cell phone or to my computer. It does require a wireless contract. So with this particular technology, we can look and see if the dogs are staying with the sheep. We can observe differences in their day versus nighttime activity levels, and we find that the dogs are much more active at night. These collars cost about $90 to build for the transponder, the collar, and the case. And then about $20 per month in wireless charges. Also using a different type of GPS transponder that will allow me to record actually positions on a minute-by-minute basis, and then analyze that location data against information that we're collecting with our game cameras. This will allow us to analyze guard dog behavior relative to wildlife, humans, other things in the environment, and also help us identify variables that affect their effectiveness. Things like the the age and the sex of the dog, the terrain, the amount of cover in a paddock, a variety of different factors. We're looking for cooperators in this project with other states and regions. I think this could be a really exciting citizen science project. And if you're interested in participating in this, there'll be contact information at the end of this presentation. This just gives you some sense of the kinds of data we can collect with these transponders. This is a 1 minute period in June. It's actually right around noontime, and you can see the yellow dots represent one dog while the pink dots represent another. We can analyze these with respect to what we're picking up in the trail cameras and where the sheep are at any particular time. So getting back to training and behavior in these dogs, a lot of the behavioral research into dogs suggests that rapid brain growth occurs from 4 to 16 weeks of age, and that this period is absolutely critical for these dogs in forming social bonds. With a pet dog, this would be the time that you'd be socializing that puppy to be around humans. With these guard dogs, what we want to do in that period is bond them with the livestock that they're going to be protecting. And so my preference is to get a dog as close to 8 weeks old as I can and put that dog immediately with sheep or with goats or with whatever livestock that I want it to spend its life with. My experience also suggests that this bonding period is critical for learning the system that the dog's going to be working in. So I want to expose those puppies at that age to our electric fencing systems, to our transportation systems, teach them how to ride in the gooseneck trailer or in the back of the truck, and then also begin to introduce them to the herding dogs that we use. If we think about the cost of these dogs, I think it's useful to split up several different elements of those costs. Certainly acquisition of the puppy is one important cost to think about, but that puppy's not ready to go to work and actually guard livestock at the time of acquisition. And so we've got this development period, which I like to think of as about 1.5 years, where we're going to manage the dog, we're going to put dog food and veterinary costs into that dog, and hopefully at the end of that 1.5 year period have a dog that's able to go out and begin to go to work. And at that point, those costs then become maintenance costs. And we would include depreciation in that cost as well, because these dogs really are assets for our livestock business. And we need to recover those costs through depreciation so that we can save capital to acquire replacement dogs. So if we think about the acquisition and development costs, if a puppy costs $400 to purchase, cost us $200 to go get the puppy, which is fairly typical from my experience. We've got 1.5 years of feed and vet costs at $450. And then I think that our success rate with these dogs is about 50%. 1 in 2 dogs ends up working in our situation. Doesn't mean they won't work for somebody else, but we keep about half the dogs we start. If we take that into account, our total investment for a working age livestock guardian dog is about $2,100. So then how do we measure success? We can determine the cost, but it's more difficult to measure the benefit of these dogs, right? So it costs, in my accounting system, costs us about $600 per year per dog in terms of dog food, veterinary costs, and depreciation. How many depredation events must a dog prevent to justify this cost? And this is, I think, one of the real challenges in researching the effectiveness of these dogs. We can determine the cost pretty easily, but who wants to be the control ranch to leave sheep unprotected to figure out how many lambs might die without a dog? Certainly not something I'm interested in doing. In terms of breeds, I get asked a lot what my favorite breed is. My favorite breed is one that performs. I'm not too concerned about what particular breed it is as long as the dog works. There is some recent research done by Julie Young and a researcher named Daniel Kinka out of Utah State that looks at some differences in response to wolves in particular with some of the newer breeds that have been brought into this country. But there seems to be more variation between individuals as there is between breeds. From a practical standpoint, I want to see the parents working, no matter what breed the dog is. I want to know that those puppies came from working genetics. Sources of dogs, as I mentioned earlier, my preference is to start my own puppies. There are some businesses that specialize in guaranteeing working age dogs. In talking with other ranchers, there seems to be kind of mixed success with this, and I think, at least in my observation, part of that is that the dogs have to be exposed to the system as well as to the ranch's specific livestock to form those bonds effectively. I like to get pups from other producers rather than from dog breeders because I want to be able to see the parents working. And I will only purchase puppies that were whelped where they could hear and smell sheep before their eyes are open. If I had goats, I'd want dogs that came from a goat operation. So I think that, from my standpoint, is really important in kind of establishing that foundation for these dogs. I don't have any experience buying these working age dogs, but I've rescued several mature dogs and have had very mixed results with these rescue dogs. We actually won't rescue dogs anymore. We'll try to find a pet home for them, but we've just found that we'd rather raise our own puppies. Our care and management routine involves once a day feeding. Because we're moving sheep so frequently, it's difficult to set up a workable creep feeding situation where we can use self-feeders for the dogs. We generally use commercial dog food, although we will feed raw mutton occasionally. It's critical to freeze raw mutton or raw goat before feeding because of the potential for tapeworms to transfer a condition called sheep measles to our sheep, which causes carcass condemnation. We do parasite control and regular vaccinations. Because we're in annual grassland where we do have a fair number of stickers, foot care is important. And that's actually one of the things that we look for now in selecting puppies. We want dogs that don't have a lot of hair between their toes. We also typically do not clip, even though we may get in a normal summer, we'll get into the 90s pretty regularly and occasionally over 100 degrees. But the research that I've seen suggests that thermal regulation for these dogs is better with their natural hair coat. Excuse me. We will clip dogs if they've got some stickers in their coat or got some problems that way, but we try to leave their hair coats alone if we can. So what I look for in terms of behavior and wildlife interactions, and this is one of our current dogs, Bodie, who's pretty comfortable with sheep, as you can tell. So barking is really these dogs' first line of defense. And we don't scold our puppies for barking. We'll go out and see what they're barking at, but we don't want to take that tool out of their toolbox. And when we're running dogs and sheep close to residential areas, we will warn neighbors that the dogs will bark, but there's typically a reason for them to bark as well. When we let dogs into a new paddock, it's interesting. They will patrol the exterior of the paddock. They'll let us know if there's any fencing problems because they'll get out, but they'll also mark their territory. And so defecation and urination is a pretty common behavior on the perimeters of pastures. They will patrol. Some dogs like to patrol more than others, and when we're running multiple dogs, we've found that one dog will typically patrol and the other dog will stay with the sheep. There seems to be more of this patrolling behavior beginning at sundown and through the night than there is during the day. We like to see some submissive behavior towards the sheep, like Bodie's exhibiting here. We want the sheep to be comfortable with the dogs as well, and so this kind of behavior is absolutely non-aggressive and non-threatening to the sheep. We want dogs that will stay back during lambing, that are protective but will allow the ewe to bond with her lambs. The dogs will clean up after birth at lambing, but we want to make sure that happens in a respectful way. As I mentioned, activity level seems to vary with the time of day, and then we want to kind of know what their proximity and response to predators and really to non-predator wildlife is. I've not observed any of our dogs fighting with predators. I think part of that's the electric fence. I know folks that run on open range where there are wolves do have documentation of fighting and actually have lost dogs to wolves. So that's something we're looking at going into the future as well. There are variations in addition to kind of these individual variations. There are certainly variations based on age and sex. And I think it's important to have different type of personalities, different individual attributes, and a variety of ages and sexes in your pack of guard dogs. So in terms of correcting inappropriate behaviors, I think it's kind of part of our strategy is to make it easy for a dog to do the right thing, which means we don't put a young dog in a position where misbehaving is a comfortable or fun option. We don't put a young dog with new lambs for that very reason. We don't want that puppy behavior or play behavior to be fun and rewarded. I have talked to producers that like to raise two puppies together and have had some success in getting them to play with each other and not with the sheep. So that may be something to think about down the road. I also, when I can catch a dog in the midst of a behavior that I want to correct, I will use what I call dog-like corrections. And by that I mean I growl at the dog. If I can get to the dog, I'll grab it by the ruff of the neck and hold it down like its mother would give it a correction. And that does seem to help. We have used dangle sticks in the past. A dangle stick is a piece of wood or even a piece of PVC pipe that's hung from a chain off the dog's collar, hangs at about knee level, and it just makes it uncomfortable to run, to chase sheep. We've had varying degrees of success with that and really have not had to use that tool with our most recent puppies. I've not used shock collars. I just have not had the ability or the need to use one. I do think that good older dogs are an important tool in this regard, and I've got a video at the end that will demonstrate that. Our dogs seem to accept our herding dogs as part of the overall system. I think part of this is that the guardian dogs observe how our herding dogs behave around the sheep. If the herding dogs were wild or were taking advantage of the sheep or were aggressive, I think that behavior might change. In my experience, this acceptance of other dogs doesn't extend to non-herding dogs or to herding dogs that are used by people that our guardian dogs don't know. And I think it's interesting that they've got that kind of a judgment about appropriate behavior with their sheep. So if we think about those three behavioral attributes that I mentioned earlier, protectiveness, trustworthiness, and attentiveness, our goal is to find that perfect combination of those three. Another producer might want a dog that's a little more protective than what we need, depending on the types of predators. But in regards to that, there are dogs that don't work in our operation, and I'll talk about what those are. But then there are also dogs that don't work at all. Dogs that kill sheep don't work at all. There are dogs in our operation that maybe don't respect the electric fence that would make a great range dog, but a sheep killer or a goat killer doesn't work for anybody. So the only dogs that we've rehomed are dogs that wouldn't stay in our fences, or in one case any fence, even an 8-foot cyclone fence. But mostly our dogs have outgrown their other bad habits. We've had dogs that have chewed on or chased lambs or have stolen lambs from their mothers. But it seems with some timely correction and with a little bit of age and with working with an older, more experienced dog, we can get them to outgrow those bad habits. Our current dogs are more successful in our system than our early dogs were. And I think, as with any type of animal management, it's important to know that you're going to learn as you go and to pay attention to those things that work and that don't work. There are some other potential problems in addition to inappropriate behavior with sheep. We've got a couple of intact male dogs that do fight on occasion. That can be an issue. Fortunately, they haven't injured one another, but that's something to think about. Biting people is certainly a liability issue, and where we've had a lot of public interaction, human interaction, we try to put dogs that are pretty trustworthy in that regard. Harassing non-target wildlife, deer or things of that nature, is something we try to pay attention to. Endangered Species Act issues can be difficult. I think one of the challenges here in California is that our state Endangered Species Act includes harassment of a listed species as a take of that species. And It's difficult to get a straight answer as to whether or not a guard dog chasing or even fighting with an endangered species, like a gray wolf, would be considered a harassment or a take. Dogs do disappear sometimes. Sometimes they have some help. There are folks that see these big white dogs out and don't understand that they're out there to protect livestock that'll pick the dogs up and take them into animal control. That's, I think, a really important reason to use these kinds of signs. Death loss can be an issue. And then public misunderstanding. You know, these dogs are working dogs that are happiest when they're with sheep. And if you try to put them in a doghouse or kennel them at night, the dog's miserable and the sheep are unprotected. And thinking about other environments, in my experience, there's some things to think about in terms of the type and number of dogs. Whether or not the flock is fenced, how big the flock is. Certainly a flock the size of ours is very different than a band of 1,000 or 1,100 ewes. The types of human interactions that the dogs will have, whether there's herders present, whether there's likely to be recreationists, mountain bikers, horseback riders, or others present. And then the types of predators, obviously. There has been some relatively recent research in Australia that suggests that using livestock guardian dogs works regardless of the size of operation, and that 66% that reported no depredation included some very large 100,000 acre operations in Australia. There was also some research done in the last 10 years or so at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in Du Bois, Idaho, that indicates that sheep that are protected by guard dogs actually increase their range of foraging and their forage consumption and efficiency, which I think suggests that these dogs have some real production benefits beyond just keeping sheep alive. Worked a little bit with Talbot Sheep Company here in California. They summer some sheep in Nevada County near where OR 54, the gray wolf, was sighted. And their response was to increase the number of dogs that they use from 4 to 6 per band. Interestingly enough, Wildlife Services did some research looking at the numbers of sheep and numbers of dogs and found that there was kind of a threshold. If you went beyond 7 or 8 dogs per group of sheep, that they actually saw some increases in depredation. And they're not really sure why that would be, but I think that's something to think about as well. There seems to be an optimal number based on that research. Prescriptive Livestock Services, which was a large-scale targeted grazing operation that worked in California and a number of other western states, found in wolf habitat that using larger intact male dogs was a pretty effective deterrent with wolves. So looking ahead at some of the research questions that I think we need to consider, one is the mechanism of protection. Do these dogs disrupt predatory behavior, or do they displace the other canine predators on the landscape? I think this is important in terms of coexistence, but one of the questions that ranchers have here in California in particular is whether a ranch that uses guard dogs simply pushes those predators to its neighbors. And I think it's important for us to kind of figure out those mechanisms. Daniel Kinka and Julie Young are looking at that. I understand we'll have some research coming out in the new year that talks about some of those mechanisms. I think the cost-benefit analysis is difficult, as I mentioned, but the suite of tools that any of us use on a ranching environment is at least partly an economic question. And so understanding how managing livestock guardian dogs fits with the rest of our operations. We see our sheep every day, and so it's not going out of our way to feed a dog once a day. Operations that may see sheep once a week or once every 2 weeks, that feeding regime could create some additional challenges. And then I think lastly, we need to understand what are the particular behavioral traits that we need to emphasize in specific environments or in response to specific predators. And how do we measure those? How do we determine whether a puppy is likely to develop those behavioral traits? And wrapping up, I want to really again stress the importance of context. You know, a dog that works in one environment might not work in another. Or a dog that's effective at protecting rams in dry ewes might not work with lambing ewes. I think it takes a special dog to work at lambing time. And then terrain, habitat type, the predator species involved, predator populations, all of those influence the success or failure of a particular dog or group of dogs. And I think understanding how each of our individual contexts might be a little bit different helps us pick the right kind of dog for our operation. And then lastly, I think the importance of paradigms comes into this. It's very similar in my experience to using electric fence or low-stress stockmanship. If you believe these livestock guardian dogs will work, you'll find ways to change your approach when they don't. And there will be a failure. There will be a time that you lose something to predators. There will be a time that a dog steals a lamb. That's the nature of using these dogs. But if you think they work, you'll find ways to change your approach to address those problems. If you don't believe they're effective, the first time they cause a problem, you're likely to abandon them as a tool. And I think that's important for us to remember as ranchers, but I also think that's important for folks who advocate for their use to understand that it's not simply like picking a hammer up out of your toolbox and pounding a nail in. If you don't believe the hammer's going to work, you probably won't grab that out of the toolbox. And then lastly, success is dependent on genetics, on rearing, on the environment, using the right dog in the right situation, and then the mix of other tools that we are using and our ability to adapt as predators adapt. We do need more research on mechanisms, on the costs versus the benefits, and on specific behavioral characteristics. Leave this up for a bit. I think these 4 references I've found to be exceptionally helpful in terms of thinking about dogs and how we might use them. The Coppinger presentation I think is really helpful. There's also some an interesting book that Ray Coppinger wrote more recently that you might be able to find on Amazon. The Kinka and Young study I think is really helpful in thinking about breeds. And then the Australian reference and the work that was done at the U.S. Sheep Center are also listed here. And so with that, if you do have questions, my email address is dmacon, M-A-C-O-N, at ucanr.edu. I want to play a couple of real quick videos here. This first video is from last lambing season, so this would have been in February of 2018. And the dog in the picture in the frame right there is Bodie, our young dog. You'll see the old dog Reno come into the frame here in just a second. But that's the first lamb that Bodie's been around at birth. Now Reno's probably just trying to protect afterbirth, but you'll notice the distance that Reno keeps from that ewe, and he just enforced a similar distance on Bodie, on the young dog. This next video is a couple of days later, so Bodie's now been around several ewes that have lambed, and he's still respectful of, certainly of Reno, and respectful of their space. So this ewe that Reno's walking up behind has just had lambs, and you'll see here in a second that Bodie's approaching another ewe with new lambs. Bodie's a little closer than I'd like to see him. but he's definitely concerned about Reno coming close to him, and he's going to leave that ewe alone. And I should note that about halfway through lambing last spring, Reno was injured, and so we had to leave Bodie there by himself, and he did a great job the rest of the year. We had no problems with him at all. We're hoping that he can similarly train a newer, younger dog that we've got this year. And so with that, happy to answer questions by email. Again, my email address is dmacon@ucanr.edu. Have a great day.